Okay, so we're back in Shake, and we have several of our set extension layers in here. This is the first one, just the set extension, everything that's stilled. The second layer is an alpha channel that I've created so that I can mat the spotlights in behind that building on the left. This is spotlight 1, and we have a second spotlight here. The next layer is a layer of just our sign text, the non-animated text. And the final layer is our animated signs, just the blue, just the cyan. And that layer should be underneath. So I'm going to go and put the two spotlights together in their own over, just because I want to keep them grouped together because I'm going to animate them later on here in Shake. They're going to go over top of the set extension, and then we're going to put the red or the pink text layer over top of all them. Now we just fed it into the rest of the chain, replace the old set extension, and render it out. We'll just do a quick comparison between the plate and the set extension. Looks pretty good. Now we want to put these spotlights in behind the buildings on the left. So if we feed the mat into the fade node, render it. Now we're going to have to invert the mat because it's showing us the wrong way. And do a render. And it looks like the spotlights are behind that building. Now let's get the animated signs in the stack. As I said earlier, we're going to want to put them just underneath the signs with the text on them. There we go. And now whenever we duplicate them and blur them, they'll bloom out from underneath the Shot Network sign and the eShop sign. So that's what we'll do here. We'll copy two of them. Make sure that top left one in the group is not going to be blurred, because that's the topmost visible layer. The entire comp. So I'm just ignoring these layers as I go through them. I'm just trying to compare what the render looks like with them blurred or with them off. I'm just going to do one at a time. So this guy here, I'm blurring 8 pixels, and this is what the render looks like. Now if I unignore this guy, put a blur on him, maybe he gets 20 pixels, render that out. You can see that the blur tends to make the glow grow, and typically I like to keep a couple layers in there. We'll keep a tighter one that's a little bit brighter, and then a secondary glow that is a little bit softer, and that way you don't have just a linear fall off as you would from one big glowing blurred layer. I often use the render buffers in Shake. You'll notice to the bottom left hand corner of the render window you see an A, and there's also a B. If you hit the number 1 on your keyboard, you can toggle between the two, and you can put a different render in each one of those. So now I'm just going to continue to search for the proper look for that glow here in Shake. It's going to be a little more complex looking than I did in Photoshop. We certainly could make it as simple as we had it in Photoshop, but I figure while we're in here, a few extra minutes, we might be able to get a nice bloom off of that cyan light. put a little fade on this one layer. Try and knock its impact down a little bit. What I'm really going for is I want to get a nice large bloom, but it's going to be very subtle. It'll grow far out from that central tower, but it won't be very opaque. Now if you select a group of nodes, you can copy and paste them with Control C and Control V. That's what I'm doing here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a little bit of a color adjustment on this one layer. A little bit of color, a little bit of contrast. I like to set up my contrast just like so. You can type in this expression REXPR to get your G and your B channels to do the same thing that you're doing with your red channel. So now you can get this curve to act like the RGB curve does in and the G separately. It's not quite there yet, so I'm going to try and darken it down. Bring the top end down a little bit and see how it works. See how it looks. It's just not really working out, so maybe let's try and use only this adjust HSV to achieve the look that we want. Sometimes you can be a lot more bold if you just jump right in here and change its value and its hue. I'm upping the saturation, and immediately you get a very punch. Dark blue rim lights and halations that we see in the plate, so I think that might be a better decision. Okay, so looks like we're running out of room in this little node view, so let's just do a little bit of rearranging. This is the great thing about working in this kind of layout. You can move your groups around and keep it pretty obvious as to what's flowing with each other and what's layered over top of one another. So I'm going to keep these two spotlights grouped together here. Overall, we're just going to try and get some motion so that the spotlight's moving pretty much all the time through the whole shot. But we also don't want to be too bold with its movement, so I'm going to try and keep the numbers pretty small. We don't really want it to lean way over, so let's keep it a little more vertical. I'm just going to render it here at different points in time and see how it looks. See where the in-between keyframes end up placing the spotlight. And we'll do the same thing to the other light, try and get a slightly different motion. This one I'm going to try and make even more subtle. I don't want it to be moving even as much as that spotlight on the right is. Okay, so that should about do it. Let's get down to the pan node. I think we should probably tweak the camera move a little bit on this shot. Since the shot network sign is really the point of the shot, I think as the camera tilts upwards, it should arrive on the top sign of the building, on the shot networks, and it should have a little bit of a pause there so that the audience can register that that really is the point of the shot. So at about frame 70 or so, I set a keyframe that will bring our camera up high enough, and then for the remainder of the shot it'll smoothen out, as you can see here with this curve. From about 70 to 100, the camera is resting at its final point, framed on the top of the building. Now I'm turning my attention to this big blue bus right in the center of the frame at the beginning of the shot. And I think what we should do is we should try and offset the time. We'll slip the sync of the plate and we'll let that bus move on down the road, so when we start our shot at frame 1, that bus won't be right smack in the center of our plate. I think that's a better solution. Okay, so why don't we render out a bunch of frames and take a look at the entire shot. I'm just going to scrub through these, and as the camera goes up we see the signs moving, the spotlight's moving, the bus is out of our way. The matte line looks good. So what I'm doing is scanning through the entire animation, scrubbing it back and forth, and put in these little ribs that you see showing through in the plate. Just a little bit of imperfection that is maybe some structure underneath the banner showing through. Looking at the plate, there's some of these seams coming through the banner, so in Photoshop I'll just make a few selections that mimics that. Now that'll allow me to affect my CG render, curving it lighter, curving it darker, and even painting over it to kind of get that same sense of imperfection just below the surface. Now I'm just going to add a few selections to the right of those previous ones. Not identical, but very similar. These ones I'll be able to curve darker, and so together the light and the dark side will form what looks to be a kind of little bump in the banner. Make them pretty subtle. We don't want them to be too distracting. And maybe we need a couple more, maybe a couple really tall ones that run almost the entire length of the banner. I'm just adding, using that selection, I'm adding to that curve. I'll try and keep a lot of these on the same curve so that I can adjust them more obvious and less obvious all at the same time. Maybe we'll add one more up here on the top right, especially since there's a little dark corner up there. We can put a light line through that and the seam will read kind of nicely. We don't want these large flatter areas to lack detail. As I mentioned before, breaking things up is definitely a good thing to do. I'm just going to follow the curvature of this billboard and see if we can put in some horizontal elements using the same curves, we'll brighten and darken some of the parts and try and get that structure to pop through. Now, even though there wasn't any horizontal elements noticeable in the plate, I'm looking at my graphic here, and because I have a little bit more blank white space here in my graphic, I think it'll help this part of the set extension to look a little more realistic. Just add a little bit of a shadow down below that. That way it looks like it's catching some of the light from above. Okay, so that should about do it here in Photoshop. Let's get back into Shake and update the set extension. Coming from the same source. And why don't we do a quick low-res render and take a look at the entire shot. We'll scrub through it back and forth. So here we have some updated animation, and we can see the ribs in that one white banner. And as well, we have our spotlights moving. So that pretty much wraps it up for all of the compositing in this shot. So here we have the final composite of the shot, complete with animated signs, the set extension, and moving spotlights in the background. We have our traffic moving on the street and people walking down the sidewalks. Right now it's playing back at 15 frames per second, and it's 720 pixels wide. So I'm going to include the final render, the large res 1K render, on the DVD, and it plays back at 24 frames per second, so it's a little more smooth. And so overall, I hope you enjoyed learning about the techniques that I use to complete set extensions for feature films, and I hope you can use this knowledge in the future.